The night of November the 6th in the year 1817 was heavy with silence, yet it was not the silence of peace. In Windsor, the palace walls seemed to draw the weight of grief upon themselves, and outside, muffled bells told a kingdom of a sorrow it had scarcely imagined. The heir to the throne, Princess Charlotte of Wales, lay dead at the tender age of 21, taken from the world in childbirth, her infant son stillborn at her side. It was as if a candle that had burned so brightly and promised such warmth had been suddenly extinguished, leaving behind the lingering scent of wax and the faint smoke that curls slowly upwards into the dark. Welcome, dear listener, to this long remembering. As you settle into your chair or your bed, I invite you to pause and let this moment become part of a shared memory that spans across time. Tell me, if you will, in the comments, where you listen and when you listen, for these connections weave us into a living web of remembrance. And if you wish to keep company with stories such as this, gentle tales of those who walked before us, press the button of subscription so the light of this channel may continue to burn quietly in your night. Her story begins not in the shadow of death, but in the cry of a newborn. On the 7th of January in the year 1796, at Carlton House in London, a child was born to George, Prince of Wales, and his wife, Caroline of Brunswick. This child was Charlotte Augusta, who would become the only legitimate grandchild of King George III. In her, the continuity of the monarchy was suddenly clear, and in her small hands the weight of future promise was placed. There was joy in that moment, though the air around her crib was already thick with the sharp edges of discord, for the marriage of her parents was troubled, and behind the doors of glittering palaces lingered bitterness and reproach. Imagine, if you will, the nursery chamber, candlelight falling across silken drapes, the faint sound of a winter wind moving outside. The newborn princess is swaddled, and her tiny breath clouds the air with warmth. Courtiers speak of destiny, of a child born to inherit a kingdom. Yet can an infant understand the murmurings of politics, the ambitions that circle her cradle like shadows? Her eyes are closed, and she dreams the untroubled dreams of infancy, while outside the city of London glitters, restless and loud, never still, always awake. Her father, George, was already estranged from his wife, and he would soon live openly apart from her. Caroline, eccentric, careless, and often the object of ridicule, found herself confined to a limited role, yet she loved her daughter with a forceful, if uneven, devotion. Charlotte would spend her childhood moving between these two figures, torn not only by their distance from one another, but also by the constant quarrels that seemed to trail in their wake. What is it, one wonders, to grow up knowing that love, which should be a single flame, is split and contested like territory? Did Charlotte sense, even as a child, that her life would never be her own, but always subject to the claims and counterclaims of others? The people, though, were quick to seize upon her image. From her earliest years, she was described as lively, strong-willed, and quick to laugh. She bore some of the plainness of the Hanoverian line, yet she carried herself with a freshness that seemed to lift the spirits of those around her. Nurses and tutors noted her impatience with strict discipline, her refusal to be molded into a docile creature of etiquette. She had a sturdiness in her step, a manner that belonged more to a child of common stock than to the stiff and rigid world of kings and queens. And perhaps it was this that made her beloved among the people. She seemed close to them, less distant than her father, who was often lampooned and criticized. Picture her at 6 years old, running through the gardens with her hair undone, cheeks flushed with the brisk English air. Behind her, a governess calls for restraint. But Charlotte turns, only briefly, eyes flashing with laughter before she runs further, out toward the light that breaks through the clouds. Even then, she was not a creature who would easily bend. She belonged, at least in part, to herself. And yet the palace corridors whispered differently. Tutors tried to instill in her the lessons of languages, of history, of duty. She learned, but she questioned. She absorbed knowledge, but she resisted constraint. Like a sapling bent too often by pruning, she would spring back, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes defiantly. What, one might ask, was her destiny shaping itself to be? A queen beloved of her people, perhaps, but also a young woman who longed for the simple kindness of an untroubled home. Her grandfather, King George III, at times afflicted with his mysterious illness of the mind, looked upon her with a gentler affection than her father could muster. To him, she was a reminder of continuity, a new branch on the family tree, and perhaps in her presence he saw the endurance of the monarchy even as his own mind faltered. To the public, too, Charlotte soon became a figure of hope. They looked upon her as one who might heal the divisions of her family, one who might embody the better virtues of royalty without its excesses. But the child herself, how did she see? Did she lie awake in her bed, the firelight flickering against the walls, and wonder why her mother and father would not speak without anger? Did she feel in her heart the strange contradiction of being cherished by a nation yet lonely in her own chambers? These questions drift like smoke across the memory of her childhood, for no diary of her tender years tells us the full truth. We must listen instead to the faint echoes left in the letters of those around her, and to the image she left in the minds of her people. As the years passed, she grew into a girl of sturdy frame, fond of riding, quick in speech, and unwilling to bow to those who sought to press her into rigid formality. She carried a warmth that drew others, and yet she also bore the burden of being the only legitimate link to the next generation of monarchs. In her figure, the hopes of a kingdom were placed, and in her laughter the people heard an echo of a better future. The bells that rang at her birth had heralded not only the arrival of a child, but also the fragile continuation of a dynasty. In those years, no other legitimate grandchildren of the king had yet been born, and so all eyes turned to Charlotte. The weight of expectation is heavy, even when unseen. Like a veil, it wrapped itself around her cradle, her play, her learning, her very steps through palace halls. And so her earliest chapter closes with the image of a child caught between two worlds. Behind her, the quarrels of her parents. Ahead of her, the unyielding demands of a nation. And within her, the fire of a spirit not easily subdued. Outside, the winter wind still moves through the trees, carrying with it the faint tolling of bells, as if to remind us that even in the innocence of childhood, the destiny of Princess Charlotte was already set upon a path shadowed by both promise and loss. The corridor stretches long and dim, its polished floor reflecting the fading light of afternoon, and at the far end a heavy door closes with a muted echo. That sound, half final and half uncertain, becomes the measure of a childhood lived between barriers. For Charlotte, daughter of the Prince of Wales and Caroline of Brunswick, the shutting of doors was no simple household noise. It was the rhythm of her earliest memories. A father retreating into his own chambers, a mother banished from his presence, messengers hurrying between one residence and another as if to stitch together a household that had never truly been whole. A child learns early, not always by words, but by the timbre of silences, by the firmness of closed doors, and by the anxious tones of servants who hover too near. She was placed often in the care of attendants, governesses, and companions, who each tried in their way to soften the estrangement of her parents. Yet even the most tender caretaker could not remove the air of suspicion and quarrel that hung over the royal household. George, her father, was critical of Caroline, speaking openly of her oddities, her careless manner, her lack of refinement. Caroline, in turn, derided her husband's excesses, his debts, his infidelity, his cruelty of spirit. Between them, Charlotte was both cherished and used, passed from one side to another, as though her very presence could vindicate one parent and condemn the other. When she spent time with her mother, there was warmth, if often of a chaotic and uncertain kind. Caroline was affectionate, even indulgent, allowing her daughter to romp more freely than was deemed proper. Yet in Caroline's household there was also an air of spectacle, of gestures meant to irritate George rather than to nurture Charlotte. What did the child feel in those moments when her mother embraced her with ardor but cast her glances toward the public eye, as though Charlotte's presence were both personal love and political statement? Perhaps the girl felt both cherished and unsettled, folded into an embrace that was never entirely private. Her father's visits were rarer, more formal, often marked by a kind of severity that chilled rather than warmed. He looked upon Charlotte not with the softness of a father, but with the calculating gaze of an heir to the throne, who saw in his daughter both promise and inconvenience. When he praised her, it was usually for what might reflect well upon himself. When he reproved her, it was often harsh, concerned more with appearances than with her inner life. And yet, like many children who yearn for the love of a distant parent, Charlotte sought his approval even when it seemed forever withheld. Such a childhood, lived between competing households, must have taught her early to guard her heart. She learned to watch, to sense the mood of a room, to know when to speak and when silence would spare her. But she also developed a resilience, a determination to carve for herself a space of independence. Those who observed her in her youth noted her strong will, her refusal to yield easily, and her bursts of temper when pressed beyond patience. Was this merely the defiance of a spirited girl? Or was it the natural shield of one who had learned that affection was uncertain and loyalty divided? Picture her at 10 years of age, seated in a room where portraits of ancestors line the walls, the scent of polish and damp wool filling the air. Her governess recites a lesson, but Charlotte's eyes wander toward the closed door beyond which she knows her parents argue. She traces her finger along the grain of the desk, restless, half listening, half imagining herself astride a horse, galloping into the fields beyond London, free of walls and voices. The door remains closed, yet her spirit presses against it, longing for escape, for a life not hemmed in by quarrel. There were moments, too, when she glimpsed the affection of her grandfather, King George III. Though often clouded by illness, his mind sometimes brightened with clarity, and in those intervals he regarded Charlotte with fondness. He saw in her the future of the dynasty, and in her company he seemed to find a balm for his troubled spirit. His love for her was simpler, perhaps, less entangled in the hostilities that marked her parents' marriage. To sit at his knee, to hear his gentle words, was to feel for a brief while that family could be steady, could be kind. But those moments were fleeting, and soon enough the shadow of his malady returned, leaving Charlotte again adrift between two uncertain parents. The public, who caught only glimpses of these domestic struggles, imagined Charlotte's childhood as bright and promising. They saw a girl of health and vitality, not the hollowed figure of a sickly heir, but a child with a lively step and a quick smile. They read reports of her riding, of her laughter, of her bold answers to tutors, and they imagined in her the seed of a monarch who might one day heal the wounds of a weary crown. Yet if they had pressed their ears to the palace walls, what would they have heard? The sound of footsteps retreating, the murmur of reproach, the thud of doors closing one upon another. A child who grows between such sounds learns, in ways unseen, the cost of distance. She becomes alert to absence, sensitive to tones, shaped by the lack as much as by the presence of love. And so Charlotte's character deepened with both fire and sadness. She was warm when she felt safe, but quick to anger when she felt confined. She craved affection but resisted domination. She sought companionship but guarded her independence fiercely. The seasons turned, and with each passing year, the distance between her parents grew more formal, more entrenched. By the time Charlotte entered her teens, the prospect of reconciliation was no longer spoken of. Caroline withdrew further from the centers of power, and George sought to diminish her influence wherever he could. And Charlotte, left to navigate the space between them, became in the eyes of the people the child of both and of neither. What does it mean to be loved by a nation and yet unsettled in one's own family? What does it mean to smile in public, to wave from a carriage, to be greeted with cheers, while in private the heart aches with longing for simplicity, for unity, for a love not fractured? These questions rise naturally when we trace the lines of Charlotte's early life. She lived not in fairy tale, not in gilded security, but in a house of mirrors, where each reflection was distorted by quarrel. And so the sound of that closing door lingers, not merely in corridors of stone, but in the corridors of memory. It becomes the symbol of her childhood, doors that separated parent from parent, doors that kept affection half hidden, doors that made a child wonder if love itself was always something on the other side. And yet behind those doors, Charlotte's spirit grew restless and unyielding, preparing her for a destiny that would demand both strength and sorrow. The quill falls, its feather trembling as it strikes the desk, and the dark ink blooms outward across the parchment, a slow and irregular flower. It is a small accident, the kind that tutors frown upon, but it tells us something of the restless hand that held it. For Charlotte, learning was never a quiet absorption, but a contest between her eager mind and her impatient spirit. Lessons in languages, history, scripture, and manners were pressed upon her, yet she did not receive them with the obedient stillness expected of a royal child. She argued, she questioned, she resisted. Her education was not so much a molding as a struggle, ink spilling where the quill slipped, words left half-written when she grew weary of confinement. Her tutors noted both her sharp wit and her quick temper. She had an ear for languages, yet she bristled when forced to recite too long. She loved tales of history and heroism, but she scoffed at endless drills of dates and genealogies. When music lessons grew tedious, she would stamp her foot or laugh aloud, dismissing the patient corrections of her instructors. And yet, beneath this unruly surface, there was intelligence and curiosity, a mind not content with rote obedience, but eager to grasp at meaning. She wanted to know why, not merely what. She wanted to test ideas, to push boundaries, to taste freedom even in the narrow world of lessons. One can imagine her seated at a desk, the parchment before her, candlelight flickering upon her flushed face. The tutor corrects her posture, urges her to hold the quill more gently, but Charlotte presses too hard, the nib scratching the paper, ink splattering. She sighs, impatient, then looks up with eyes bright, not with apology, but with challenge. It is as though she is asking silently, "Why must I bend when the world itself is wide and full of wind?" The ink stain spreads, ungoverned, and in that stain lies the image of her spirit, unwilling to remain confined to neat lines. Her father grew uneasy with these reports. George preferred the image of a docile daughter, a princess who would reflect his dignity and reinforce his authority. Charlotte's fiery independence unsettled him. He heard of her blunt remarks, her refusal to flatter, her habit of speaking openly even when silence would have been wiser. To him, these were flaws. To the people, however, they were virtues. They loved her directness, her lack of pretension, her seeming closeness to ordinary human feeling. In a court grown stiff and artificial, Charlotte's candid spirit was like a breath of unfiltered air. But within the palace walls, such air was not always welcome. Her governesses tried to curb her temper, tried to press her into the mold of a proper royal maiden. They corrected her laughter when it rang too loud, her steps when they grew too free, her words when they cut too sharp. Charlotte listened, but only half. Her compliance was temporary, her defiance inevitable. At times she seemed to yield, only to break forth again with sudden force, like a river held by stones until it found its path around them. She loved riding most of all. On horseback she felt free, her body moving with the animal, the wind rushing past her face, the world widening beyond the suffocating rooms of tutors and lectures. Here was learning of another kind: balance, strength, command, but also release. Those who saw her ride spoke of her vigor, her delight, her sense of mastery. It was in the saddle, perhaps, that Charlotte most fully felt herself. Alive, unbound, untethered from the quarrels and expectations that pressed upon her in every other sphere. What did she dream of in those years when she was half child, half maiden? Did she imagine a future in which her spirit would not be so constrained? Did she believe that her laughter could one day ring without reproach, that her opinions might one day shape rather than scandalize the world around her? Or did she already sense that her role would be forever contested, her freedom always compromised by duty? These questions rise like mist from the traces of her youth, never fully answerable, but always lingering. Her mother encouraged her independence, though sometimes recklessly. Caroline delighted in Charlotte's quick tongue and her refusal to be cowed. She praised her daughter's defiance, sometimes using it as a weapon in her own battles against George. But in doing so, she sharpened Charlotte's sense of division, teaching her, perhaps without meaning to, that rebellion was not only personal, but also political. Each burst of temper, each act of resistance could be seen as taking a side, and Charlotte, still so young, was caught in a storm of allegiances she could scarcely control. And yet, despite the turbulence, Charlotte's charm endured. Those who met her spoke of her vitality, her warmth, her ability to draw others into her laughter, even as she exasperated her tutors. She was not polished, not delicate, not the ideal of quiet grace that so many courtiers cherished, but she was real, and in her reality the people found something to love. She was not a porcelain figure set high upon a shelf. She was flesh and spirit, imperfect and alive. The quill, fallen and ink-stained, becomes again a symbol of her youth. She wrote letters to friends, to companions, sometimes in haste, her words spilling across the page with uneven spelling, with sudden bursts of humor, with candid confessions. They were not the carefully measured words of a princess, schooled in etiquette, but the lively speech of a young woman who wanted to speak truly, even if the lines blurred or the ink smudged. In these letters, more than in official records, we glimpse the Charlotte who was both heir to the throne and yet also simply a girl of her age, longing, laughing, impatient, alive. And so this chapter of her life gathers itself around the image of education. Lessons pressed upon her, resistance springing forth, ink spreading beyond its bounds. She was shaped, but she resisted shaping. She was taught, but she questioned teaching. She was corrected, but she insisted on her own voice. In this tension, her character grew, sharp and warm, difficult and beloved. Outside the window, the sound of voices fades into whispers. Courtiers murmur, gossip spreads, stories of her defiance are told in both admiration and reproach. Some shake their heads, fearing what such a spirit might mean for the future of the crown. Others smile quietly, sensing in her a vitality that could renew the monarchy itself. The whispers mingle, soft and uncertain, like the rustling of leaves in a restless wind, carrying us onward into the next chapter of her life. The whispers drift like smoke along the high corridors, hushed yet insistent, each word slipping from one mouth to another. Gossip at court is never idle. It is a current, subtle and relentless, carrying news, judgments, hopes, and fears. In these murmured conversations, Charlotte's name appeared often, not only because she was the sole legitimate grandchild of King George III, but because she seemed to embody both promise and peril for the monarchy. She was, to many, a living contrast to her father, George, Prince of Wales, whose excesses, debts, and unpopularity had long weighed upon the crown. Where he was distrusted, she was cherished. Where he was mocked, she was admired. And so the whispers grew, painting her as the people's hope, the bright dawn against a sky of disappointment. In taverns and drawing rooms, in the carriages that rattled through London streets, her name was spoken with unusual warmth. The people called her good-hearted, lively, unspoiled by the arrogance of royalty. They told stories of her laughter, her straightforward manner, her disregard for stiff pretension. She became, in their eyes, less a princess of distant palaces and more a figure of kinship, someone whose humanity shone through the gilded frame. They did not see the restless child who spilled ink on parchment, nor the lonely girl caught between estranged parents. They saw instead a young woman who might one day reign with a touch closer to the heart of her people. The court, however, was divided. Some welcomed her popularity, believing it could restore affection for the monarchy. Others muttered uneasily, for a princess beloved by the crowd could easily become a rallying point, a challenge to established authority. And always her father listened, unsettled by reports that his daughter was adored more than he. His vanity, sharp and easily wounded, felt the contrast keenly. It was as though every cheer for Charlotte was a reproach to him. Every smile given to her was a shadow cast upon his own throne of expectation. What does it mean, one wonders, for a young woman to carry the love of a nation? Is it a blessing, warm and sustaining, or is it a burden, heavy with expectation, impossible to fulfill? Charlotte, still in her teenage years, could not have known the full weight of it, but she must have felt the stirrings. Whenever she appeared in public, crowds gathered. Whenever she rode through the streets, voices rose in welcome. She smiled, she waved, but beneath that brightness was the unease of one who knows that the eyes of a kingdom are upon her every step. Imagine her at 15, seated in a carriage, the windows half open, her hair pinned but slightly undone by the rush of air. The people press close, their faces alight with admiration, their hands raised in greeting. She returns their smiles, but in the privacy of her thoughts she wonders, do they love me for myself or for what I represent? Do they see me as Charlotte, restless, opinionated, yearning for freedom, or as the image of hope, fashioned to fit their desire? The whispers of gossip might not answer her, but they would not cease, weaving her image into the fabric of public longing. Her mother, Caroline, took comfort in this public affection for her daughter. She encouraged Charlotte's closeness with the people, seeing in it a weapon against George. Caroline herself was popular with certain circles, especially those who opposed the Prince of Wales, but her reputation was too often marred by scandal and ridicule. Charlotte's popularity, by contrast, was pure and hopeful, untainted by accusation. It was as though the daughter could redeem what the mother could not. Yet this too sharpened the division, for George resented both mother and child, sensing in their bond a challenge to his authority. Charlotte's tutors and attendants observed with growing awareness that their charge was no ordinary heir. She was not merely learning to fill a role. She was becoming, in the imagination of the public, a symbol of renewal. They worried that her outspokenness, her quick temper, might one day harm her. Yet they could not deny the charm she carried, the authenticity that no etiquette could extinguish. Even in her awkwardness, even in her refusal to conform, she shone with a light that others recognized as rare. The whispers at court became a chorus in the city. Printers published her likeness. Shops sold small portraits. Ballads were sung in her praise. She was spoken of as the future queen who might heal divisions, who might bring honesty where there had been deception, warmth where there had been coldness. The people did not know the fullness of her struggles, yet their affection was genuine, and in it, Charlotte found both comfort and pressure. To be so beloved is to be held to a vision one did not choose. Did she ever wish in those quiet evenings when the lamps were lit and the corridors grew still that she could be less adored, less visible, less bound to expectation? Did she long to be simply a young woman, free to choose her path, her friends, her laughter, without the constant gaze of strangers? Perhaps. And yet perhaps she also cherished the knowledge that she was loved, that despite the quarrels of her family, she had the loyalty of a nation. Between these feelings her heart must have moved, unsettled, uncertain, balancing pride with loneliness. The muffled whispers of gossip never ceased, and within them grew both admiration and anxiety. To the people, she was hope. To her father, she was both daughter and rival. To her mother, she was comfort and weapon. And to herself, she was still searching, still becoming, still restless in the shadow of crowns. And so this chapter closes with the sound of whispers fading, carrying with them not only words, but the weight of expectation. They settle into silence, and in that silence we hear the turn of carriage wheels upon gravel, halting at a crossroad. The wheels of the carriage grind upon the gravel, slowing until they halt with a sigh, as if the horses themselves sense the weight of the moment. A crossroad lies ahead, not of earth and stone alone, but of destiny. For Charlotte, now a young woman with the eyes of a kingdom upon her, the question of marriage had become unavoidable. To whom she would bind her life was not merely a private choice, but a matter of politics, of alliances, of dynastic survival. And so the road branched, and she could not stand still forever. From her earliest years the talk had circled. She must marry well, she must marry wisely, she must marry soon. Courtiers and statesmen weighed the possibilities, measuring princes and dukes as though they were pieces upon a board, each move calculated to strengthen or weaken the position of Britain in the shifting tides of Europe. Yet Charlotte was no pawn. She might be urged, persuaded, even pressed, but she possessed a spirit unwilling to surrender without protest. And so the debates about her marriage became more than political strategy. They became the testing ground of her independence. Her father, George, looked toward William of Orange, heir to the Dutch throne. It was a match that promised strong alliance, a joining of two royal houses that could stabilize power across the continent. The plan was set forth with the approval of ministers, with the nod of diplomats, with the confidence of men who believed they could arrange a princess's heart as they arranged treaties. Charlotte was introduced to William, and at first she listened, she considered, she endured the conversation. But as days passed and the prospect grew nearer, her resistance sharpened. For to marry William meant not only binding herself to a man she did not love, but also to leave her homeland, to live in Holland, to be exiled from the soil that had shaped her. Imagine her in her chamber, pacing before the tall window, her breath fogging the glass as she presses her palm against it. Outside, the gardens are still, the branches bare in winter light. She knows what is asked of her: duty, sacrifice, submission. Yet within her heart the thought rises, insistent that she will not leave England, that she will not be torn away from the people who had cherished her, from the land whose fields and skies had given her a sense of belonging. It was not stubbornness alone, it was identity. To live elsewhere was to lose herself. Her father pressed her, harshly at times. Arguments rose, voices grew sharp, the old divisions of family deepened, but Charlotte held her ground. She spoke openly of her unwillingness. She wept, she pleaded, she raged. Those around her were startled by the force of her determination. Rarely had a princess of Britain so openly defied her father's will in such a matter. Yet she did not yield. The crossroad before her demanded a choice, and she chose the path of resistance, even though it meant quarrel, uncertainty, and the risk of estrangement. What does it mean, one wonders, for a young woman to turn from duty toward the stirrings of her own heart? Was she selfish, as some at court muttered, unwilling to place the needs of the nation above her own desire? Or was she courageous, asserting her right to shape her own destiny in a world that sought to shape it for her? The truth may lie between, suspended like the carriage at the crossroad, waiting for movement, waiting for decision. The people, when they heard whispers of her resistance, felt a strange pride. She seemed closer to them than ever, not a distant figure obeying commands, but a young woman insisting on her own will, as any daughter might. They admired her for standing firm, for refusing exile, for keeping herself tied to England's soil. She became, in their eyes, not only a princess, but a patriot. In her refusal they saw strength, and in her strength they saw hope. The ministers, however, grew uneasy. Alliances slipped away, negotiations faltered, and the future of succession seemed uncertain. If Charlotte would not marry William, then who? The crossroad did not end with refusal. It demanded another choice, another path. And so the search continued, names whispered in corridors, possibilities weighed in chambers lit late into the night. Meanwhile, Charlotte waited, restless, caught between hope and dread. She longed for love, for companionship, for a marriage that would bring warmth rather than exile. Yet she knew that her choice would never be wholly her own. It would be pressed, shaped, directed by those whose concerns lay not in her happiness, but in politics. The ink stain of her youth had spread into the parchment of her adulthood, and still she resisted the neat lines others sought to draw for her. Imagine again the halted carriage, its wheels resting upon the stones of a crossroad. The horses stamp, the reins tremble, the air is heavy with decision. Charlotte sits within, her hand upon the window, her eyes searching the horizon. Which road will be chosen? Which path will carry her forward? For now the carriage waits, suspended between duty and desire, between exile and belonging, and in that waiting lies the shape of her life, a spirit unwilling to yield, a destiny unwilling to let her rest. The gravel stirs as the horses paw the ground, and above them clouds gather thick with rain. The first drops fall, pattering upon the carriage roof, tapping upon the windows, as though nature itself marks the tension of the moment. The rain will fall harder, restless and insistent, carrying us forward into the next chapter, where decisions meet defiance, and the storm outside echoes the storm within. The rain taps upon the windows, first a scattering like the touch of fingertips, then a steady patter that seems to press the whole house into a hush. Within the palace rooms the light is dim, candles flicker uncertainly, and Charlotte sits listening to the storm as though it speaks to her own unrest. The matter of William of Orange has not ended quietly. It has become a wound between father and daughter, deepened by quarrels, sharpened by pride. George presses for obedience, insisting that the match would secure the throne, secure Europe, secure his own dignity. Charlotte, with equal force, refuses. She will not live in Holland. She will not be exiled from her land. She will not surrender her heart to a man she cannot love. The tapping of the rain is like her resolve, relentless, unyielding, filling the silence with its steady defiance. In these days her spirit showed itself most clearly. When summoned by her father, she stood before him pale but unwavering. She heard his reproaches, his accusations of ingratitude, his threats of confinement. She did not bend. At one point, she even fled, rushing from Warwick House into the London streets, seeking refuge with her mother, a gesture both desperate and bold. The people saw her, their princess moving not in gilded carriage but on foot, seeking safety like any daughter in distress. Crowds gathered, voices rose, sympathy turned instantly toward her. George was humiliated, his authority challenged not by ministers or soldiers, but by his own child. What does it mean when a princess chooses flight rather than submission? Was it rebellion, or was it simply the cry of a young woman unwilling to be broken? The answer lies perhaps in both. She was royal, yet she was also human. Her tears were real, her terror real, her longing for shelter in her mother's arms real. The rain that fell that day seemed to blur the line between palace and street, between heir to the throne and daughter in distress. William of Orange, caught in this storm, became more a symbol than a suitor. To him, the marriage might have been a duty accepted, an arrangement of crowns and treaties. But Charlotte saw in it exile, loneliness, loss. The thought of leaving England haunted her more deeply than the thought of marrying a man she did not love, for she felt tied to the land, to the people, to the air she breathed. She could not imagine life as a foreign queen, distant from the soil where her laughter and tears had fallen. In this she was not merely stubborn, but rooted, as if her very spirit had grown into the English earth. Her refusal, though it angered her father, brought her closer to the public heart. The people admired her defiance, whispering that at last there was a royal who would not yield blindly to power. They told one another that Charlotte was her own mistress, that she would not be carried away against her will. They saw in her a strength that promised a future queen who might rule with integrity, with honesty, with closeness to the nation. The storm outside mirrored the storm within, but the people heard in the rain not destruction, but cleansing. Her father did not forgive easily. He withdrew from her, cold and embittered, seeking to punish her with silence. He believed she had humiliated him, weakened his authority, made a mockery of his plans. Yet Charlotte did not collapse under this weight. Instead, she carried herself with a mixture of sorrow and resolve, knowing she had risked much, but also knowing she could not have done otherwise. To yield would have been to lose herself. Better quarrel, better estrangement, better storm than exile of the soul. Picture her in her chamber again, the rain still falling, the candles flickering low. She leans upon the window frame, her forehead against the cool glass, her breath clouding the pane. Her hands are clasped before her, not in prayer perhaps, but in steadying herself. Behind her lies the quarrel with her father, before her lies uncertainty. Yet in that moment she feels her choice confirmed. She has said no, and the word has shaped her destiny as much as any crown. The rain slides down the glass in long streams, and she watches as though they carry away the old plan, the old match, leaving the future yet unwritten. The story of William of Orange faded in time, but it left its mark. Charlotte had asserted herself, claimed her right to choose, declared her unwillingness to be moved like a piece upon the board. That defiance would shape the years ahead, would define her in the eyes of both her supporters and her critics. She had shown that she was no shadow of her father, no puppet of ministers, but a will of her own, stubborn, fiery, and deeply tied to the soil of her birth. The rain continued long into the night, washing the city, tapping upon roof and window, carrying into dreams the sound of persistence. And when morning came, the streets were fresh with scent, the stones darkened with damp, the air sharpened by the storm's passing. Out of that cleansing silence came the faint glimmer of new possibility. The suitor from Holland had gone, the exile averted, the path of obedience refused. But what path remained? The question lingered, like a sky still clouded after rain, waiting for the next turn of light. The drops upon the glass fall slower now, the storm easing, leaving behind the faint rhythm of water still dripping from eaves. Into that quiet comes another glimmer of light, reflected softly in a polished ring, waiting to be placed upon a hand. The candlelight trembles in the draught of a quiet chamber, and upon the polished surface of a simple ring, the glow flickers like a captured star. That ring, waiting to be placed upon Charlotte's hand, held the promise, not of exile, but of belonging. It was not the cold symbol of a political bargain, like the match proposed with William of Orange, but the token of a gentler bond, a union formed in affection as well as in duty. The man to whom she now turned was Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, a prince of modest means compared to the great powers of Europe, yet one whose steadiness and kindness touched her heart. Leopold was unlike the figures who had been paraded before her in earlier years. He was calm, deliberate in speech, gentle in manner. Where others boasted, he listened. Where others demanded, he reassured. Charlotte, with her fiery temper and restless independence, might have seemed ill-suited to such quietness, but in his presence she found a calm she had rarely known. The quarrels of her parents, the demands of her father, the whispers of the court, all seemed to soften when Leopold spoke, his voice low, his words measured, his eyes steady. He was, as one observer described him, like a rock upon which the storm could break harmlessly. Their courtship was not long, but it carried a different character than the negotiations with William. Charlotte chose Leopold, and in choosing him she claimed again the independence she had asserted in refusing exile. She loved him, not with the wild passion of a romantic tale, but with the deep gratitude of a heart that had long sought steadiness. She saw in him a partner who would not crush her spirit, who would not treat her as a pawn, who would not demand exile but would share her belonging to England. In his presence, she could breathe more easily, laugh more freely, rest more securely. The people rejoiced. When word spread of the engagement, crowds gathered to cheer. Their affection for Charlotte now expanded to embrace the man she had chosen. They spoke of Leopold as a fitting match, not too grand to threaten, not too foreign to estrange, but dignified, honorable, and most importantly, beloved by the princess herself. The streets of London echoed with their delight, and for once the crown seemed lifted above quarrel into harmony. Picture the wedding day, May the 2nd, 1816, St. James's Palace adorned with flowers and bright with the glow of expectation. The carriages rattled, the bells rang, the streets filled with eager faces. Charlotte entered the chapel with her usual mixture of nervousness and determination, her gown heavy with satin and silver, her veil shimmering in the light. Leopold stood awaiting her, composed, his figure tall, his bearing soldierly but softened by affection. When they joined hands, when the ring slipped upon her finger, the candlelight caught the band of gold, and in that gleam the people saw not only a marriage, but a new chapter for their princess. The service concluded, the couple emerged to cheers that seemed to swell from every corner. The crowd shouted their names, the bells pealed again, the air was thick with celebration. Charlotte smiled, radiant not with ceremony alone, but with a genuine joy that could not be feigned. For once, the divisions of her family, the quarrels of court, the weight of politics, all seemed distant. In that moment she was simply a bride, cherished, hopeful, beginning a life she believed would bring her peace. Their married life began quietly, away from the constant gaze of court. They settled at Claremont, a modest estate compared to the grandeur of palaces, but filled with the comfort of trees, gardens, and rooms that belonged to them alone. Here Charlotte found a happiness she had scarcely imagined. She and Leopold walked the grounds together, speaking of their hopes, their plans, their simple pleasures. She laughed more often, her temper softened, her restlessness eased. She still carried the fire of her spirit, but now it burned within the warmth of companionship rather than flaring in loneliness. Leopold, for his part, proved the gentle partner she had expected. He guided without pressing. He steadied without restraining. He listened when she spoke with the rush of emotion, and he answered with calm. Where her father had scolded, Leopold reassured. Where her mother had encouraged rebellion, Leopold offered balance. He became to her not only a husband, but an anchor. And in that anchoring, Charlotte blossomed. The people, too, rejoiced in her happiness. Reports of her contentment at Claremont spread through London, and the affection they felt for her deepened. They imagined her not as a figure imprisoned in palaces, but as a young wife living a life of gentle domesticity, closer to their own. Her popularity, already strong, grew still greater, and many believed that the crown's future had never seemed brighter. Yet even in happiness, shadows lingered. Her father remained distant, his pride still wounded by her earlier defiance. He gave his approval to the marriage, but without warmth, without reconciliation. Caroline, too, though glad of her daughter's happiness, was now further estranged, her role diminished, her presence less central. Charlotte's world narrowed to herself and Leopold, to Claremont and its gardens, to the laughter that now filled its rooms. For her, that narrowing was a gift. For history, it was the brief calm before the storm. Imagine her one evening at Claremont, seated with Leopold in the quiet of the drawing room. The fire glows upon the hearth, the scent of wood smoke lingers, and outside the windows the night is soft with stars. She leans back, her hand resting upon his, her laughter gentler now, her voice calmer. She speaks of the future, of children perhaps, of years to come, of a reign they might share together. Leopold listens, nods, his eyes steady, his voice low, affirming. In that moment Charlotte feels secure, as though the storms of her youth have passed and a steady dawn has begun. The candle burns low, its flame steady, its wax running slowly down the side. The ring upon her hand catches the light once more, gleaming faintly, a circle unbroken, a promise enduring. Yet even as it shines, the laughter fades into the sound of the night wind, carrying us onward to the next chapter where hope will grow heavy with expectation. The night wind drifts through the trees of Claremont, carrying away the echo of Charlotte's laughter, leaving behind only the rustle of leaves and the faint sighing of branches. Within the house, the windows glow with lamplight, and inside those rooms, for the first time in her life, Charlotte knew something like peace. The turbulence of her childhood, the quarrels of her parents, the bitter disputes over marriage, all seemed to recede into a distance, made dim by love's steadiness. In Leopold she had found a companion whose quiet presence softened her temper, whose patience steadied her impulses, whose affection gave her a sense of safety that she had long been denied. Life at Claremont was not grand by the standards of royalty. The house was pleasant, its gardens extensive, but it lacked the sheer pomp of palaces and courts. Yet this was precisely what Charlotte desired. She was weary of endless ceremony, weary of being paraded as a symbol. Here she could walk the grounds without the watchful gaze of courtiers. She could sit by the fire in simple dress. She could laugh without fear of reproach. It was, in its modest way, a retreat, a sanctuary where she could practice the ordinary happiness that had so often eluded her. Those who visited spoke of her cheer, of the warmth that filled the rooms. They saw a young couple genuinely content, not merely bound by duty, but bound by mutual affection. Charlotte's moods, once so mercurial, grew gentler, though the spark of her wit and her blunt honesty remained. Leopold encouraged her to speak freely, but his calm replies helped her to temper the edge of her words. The storm of her spirit had not vanished, but it now rolled across skies less dark, less threatening. In his company, she learned that strength need not always be defiance. It could also be endurance, patience, constancy. In the gardens, she walked often, sometimes with Leopold at her side, sometimes alone, pausing to look upon the flowers, to listen to the call of birds, to breathe the cool air. These walks became her true solace. Nature, so steady and unjudging, seemed to reflect her own desire for simplicity. She would pause before a tree, her hand resting upon its bark, as though it might share with her some of its quiet endurance. She would look upon the sky at dusk, the softening of light across the horizon, and she would imagine the years ahead, filled with the promise of children, of mornings and evenings shared, of a reign that might one day rest upon such gentle foundations. The people, too, rejoiced in this quiet chapter. News spread of her happiness, of the laughter at Claremont, of the bond between her and Leopold. Pamphlets and prints carried stories of their contentment, and the public embraced them as a symbol of renewal. At last, they believed, the monarchy had a pair who reflected their own longings: love, stability, domestic virtue. Charlotte, once the restless girl, was now the serene young wife, and Leopold, once the foreign prince of modest standing, was now cherished as the consort of Britain's hope. And yet, though happiness surrounded her, there remained a shadow that could not be entirely dispelled. Her father continued to keep his distance, his pride too deep, his wounds too raw to allow full reconciliation. Letters passed between them, but the warmth of true closeness never returned. Her mother, likewise, grew more isolated, her eccentricities and scandals alienating even those who had once sympathized. Charlotte was caught between these two figures still, but now she chose to turn her gaze inward, toward her own home, her own life, her own joy. The quarrels of the past remained, but they no longer defined her present. There is a tenderness in imagining her at Claremont in the evening, seated near the hearth with her embroidery in hand, the faint hum of her voice carrying a tune half remembered from childhood. Leopold reads quietly nearby, his posture relaxed, his presence steady. The firelight plays across their faces, across the simple furnishings of the room, across the walls that now echo not with quarrels but with calm. Outside, the wind stirs the trees, but within, the stillness is deep, a rare and precious gift for a young woman who had known so much turmoil. In those days, Charlotte wrote letters that revealed her contentment. She spoke of Leopold with admiration, describing his goodness, his steadiness, his kindness. She spoke of her happiness at Claremont, her gratitude for the life she now lived. Her words were not the restless outbursts of her youth, but the thoughtful expressions of a woman who had found, at least for a time, the peace she had long sought. Her handwriting, still uneven, still prone to hurried strokes, now carried lines that seemed less hurried, more settled, as though the calm of her life seeped even into the flow of her pen. What is it, one wonders, that makes happiness so precious in memory? Perhaps it is the knowledge that it does not last forever, that it comes in fleeting seasons, that it shines brightest when contrasted with sorrow. Charlotte's time at Claremont was such a season, bright with laughter, tender with love, simple in its joys. She could not have known how brief it would be, how fragile, how easily broken by the weight of fate. But perhaps in those moments she did not need to know. It was enough to live, to breathe, to love, to laugh, to be free for once from the burdens of quarrel and the chains of duty. The night wind rises again, moving through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of her laughter, fading, but not gone. It drifts into the distance, mingling with the dark, and in its place comes a new sound, the soft creak of wood, the gentle rocking of a cradle waiting in silence. The cradle rocks gently, though no hand yet touches it, as though moved by some unseen current of air, a promise awaiting fulfillment. Its wooden frame creaks softly, a lullaby without words, a rhythm without voice. In that quiet room at Claremont, the cradle became the vessel of hope, for Charlotte was with child, and all England seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. The princess, who had been the nation's darling, whose marriage had brought joy to a weary people, was now expected to bring forth the continuation of the royal line. Within her womb, the future of a kingdom seemed to stir. From the moment her condition was known, the whispers began anew. Not whispers of scandal this time, nor of quarrel, but of expectation, of hope, of renewal. Courtiers speculated on the sex of the child, ministers on the implications for succession, the people on the joy of seeing their beloved Charlotte as a mother. Pamphlets hinted at the blessings of domestic virtue. Poets wrote lines of rejoicing, and across the land there was a sense of waiting, a hush like the air before dawn. Charlotte herself entered this season with a mixture of delight and trepidation. She longed for motherhood, for the chance to nurture, to pour into her child the love that had so often been fractured in her own childhood. She imagined holding her infant in her arms, imagined the small weight of it, the soft breath against her cheek, the unbreakable bond that no quarrel of parents, no intrigue of court could shatter. Yet she also felt the weight of expectation, the gaze of a nation pressing upon her, the knowledge that this was no private event, but a matter of dynastic survival. She was not merely carrying a child, she was carrying the crown's future. Leopold watched over her with quiet devotion. He guided her through her days with care, urging her to rest, walking with her through the gardens at a slower pace, ensuring that her comfort was tended to at every turn. He spoke to her with reassurance, reminding her of the happiness they shared, reminding her that their child would be not only heir to a throne, but also the fruit of their love. His calmness was a balm to her, his presence a constant shield against the anxiety that sometimes stirred in her heart. Imagine them together in the soft light of evening, seated near the cradle that awaited their child. Charlotte, her hands resting upon her swelling figure, speaks with a smile of the future, what the child will look like, whose temperament it will inherit, what joys it will bring. Leopold listens, nodding, his expression serene, his hand resting gently upon hers. In that moment, the palace intrigues, the quarrels of her parents, the expectations of ministers, all seem to fall away. They are simply two young people waiting for the arrival of a new life, filled with tenderness and quiet hope. The people followed each report with eagerness. Newspapers carried updates, gossip carried details, and all across Britain, the expectation grew. It was said that never before had the birth of a royal child been awaited with such warmth, for the people did not merely long for an heir. They longed for Charlotte's happiness. They had grown to love her, to see in her the reflection of their own struggles, their own desires. Her child, they believed, would not only secure the succession, but would also renew the monarchy with the promise of a more human, more affectionate reign. Yet beneath the surface of joy, there was also unease. Charlotte's health had sometimes been uncertain, her constitution not fragile, but not robust either. Some physicians worried quietly, though none would say so too loudly, that childbirth carried risks for her. Medical knowledge was limited, and the practices of the time were often as dangerous as they were protective. But hope drowned out fear, and the cradle remained the symbol not of peril, but of promise. Charlotte herself felt the mingling of emotions. She wrote of her anticipation, of her delight in preparing for motherhood, yet she also confessed moments of anxiety, moments when she feared the ordeal ahead. She prayed quietly in her own way, asking for safety, asking for strength, asking above all for the life of the child she carried. In these moments, she revealed the same blend of courage and vulnerability that had always marked her character, fiery and bold in public, tender and uncertain in private. What is it to wait for a child? It is to live in the space between hope and fear, between dreams and realities yet unseen. For Charlotte, that space was filled not only with her own longing, but with the longing of an entire nation. Every beat of her heart seemed to echo in the chambers of history, every breath to carry the weight of dynastic expectation. And yet, within the walls of Claremont, amid the gardens and the soft light of evening, she could still cradle her dreams quietly, as any young mother might. The cradle, rocking gently in silence, captures that moment suspended in time. Empty now, but soon to be filled. Still now, but soon to carry the gentle breathing of a newborn. Silent now, but soon to echo with the cries of new life. The candle burns beside it, its flame steady, its wax slowly melting, as though marking the hours of waiting, the days of anticipation. Outside, the night deepens. The stars emerge. The wind stirs softly, carrying the promise into the dark. And as the cradle rocks, the silence lengthens, as though the whole world pauses to listen, waiting for the cry that has not yet come. The cradle rocked in silence, and then, one November night, silence became the only sound. For more than 50 hours Charlotte labored, her body weary, her spirit tested beyond measure, the hope of a kingdom bound within the ordeal of her pain. The doctors came and went, their faces shadowed by lamplight, their whispers urgent but uncertain. Outside, the autumn winds moved through the trees of Claremont, carrying the scent of damp leaves, carrying also the unspoken prayers of a nation waiting through the long night. At last a child was born, but the breath of life did not come. The infant, a son so long awaited, lay still. Charlotte, exhausted, pale, her strength drained by endless hours, asked to see the child, and when she was told that he had not lived, she did not cry out but seemed only to sink deeper into her weariness. For a few brief hours she lingered, speaking softly to those near her, comforted by the presence of Leopold, who refused to leave her side. He held her hand, kissed her brow, whispered words of love and encouragement. She pressed his hand faintly in return, and then, as the night deepened, her breath grew shallow. By morning, she too was gone, leaving only silence, heavy and absolute. The stillness that followed was unlike any other. It was not the peace of rest, but the silence of absence, a void so sudden and complete that those in the chamber scarcely knew how to move, how to speak. The candle flames flickered, the curtains stirred faintly, the cradle stood untouched. The doctors lowered their heads, the attendants wept quietly. Leopold sat in stunned grief. A princess, a wife, a daughter, a mother, all within one, had passed away at the age of 21, carrying with her the hopes of a kingdom. Outside, word began to spread. Messengers carried the news to London, to ministers, to the court, to the king. Bells tolled, muffled, as though even sound itself must grieve. Shops closed, theaters darkened, the city sank into mourning. Across the land the silence deepened, broken only by the tolling of bells, by the hushed sobs of crowds gathered in the streets. It was said that the grief was greater than at the death of kings, greater than at the fall of battles. For Charlotte was not only heir to the throne, she was the people's beloved, the promise of a future brighter than the present, the tender hope of renewal. And now she was gone, leaving only the emptiness of what might have been. Leopold sat in his solitude, broken. He had been at her side in her last breath. He had felt her hand fall limp in his. He had heard the silence where her voice had been. In the days that followed, he moved like a shadow, speaking little, eating little, his eyes hollow with grief. He wrote later that he had lost not only a wife, but the very light of his life. His sorrow was so deep, so consuming, that those around him feared it would destroy him. He kept her possessions near. He lingered in the rooms they had shared. He carried her memory as a wound that never fully healed. What does it mean, one wonders, for a nation to lose not only its heir but its symbol of hope? It was not merely succession that was shaken, but the spirit of the people themselves. They had believed in Charlotte, not only as future queen, but as one of their own, a woman who laughed, who loved, who resisted, who hoped. Her death was not only a dynastic tragedy, it was a personal grief felt by millions. Men wept openly in the streets. Women sobbed as though for a sister. Children were hushed with the news that the princess they had cheered was no more. The silence after her death was not confined to Claremont. It spread across the land like a shadow. The funeral was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, on a cold November day. The cortege moved slowly, the coffin draped in black, the air filled with the muffled beat of drums. Crowds gathered along the route, silent, many in tears. Inside the chapel, the air was heavy with candle smoke, the organ's notes mournful, the prayers intoned with voices strained by grief. Charlotte was laid to rest with her stillborn child at her side, mother and son together in death, as they had been in their final hours of life. The stone closed over them, but the silence remained, echoing in the hearts of all who had loved her. In that silence, questions lingered, unspoken but unyielding. Could her death have been prevented? Had the doctors acted differently? Was she lost to misjudgment, to the practices of medicine that bound themselves more to tradition than to wisdom? Or was it fate, unavoidable, the inexorable hand of destiny closing upon her life? No answer could be given, no certainty offered. Only silence remained, as though history itself had drawn a veil over the truth, leaving behind only sorrow and speculation. Imagine the cradle once more, rocking gently in an empty room. It had been the vessel of hope. Now it was the emblem of loss. The wooden frame stands still, its creak no longer heard, its promise unfulfilled. The candle that once burned beside it is extinguished, leaving only the faint scent of smoke, the curling thread that rises into the dark and disappears. The stillness spreads outward into every chamber, into every heart, into the very air of Britain itself. It lingers not only as grief, but as a haunting, a question without answer, a promise without fulfillment. And in that stillness, broken only by the tolling of muffled funeral bells, the story moves onward, not into joy, but into the long shadows of mourning that would shape all that followed. A black ribbon lies upon the table, coiled at first, then slowly unfurling as though drawn by some unseen hand. Its length spills across the wood, silent, without ornament, without end. In that ribbon is the image of Leopold's mourning, the grief that spread through his days after Charlotte's death, uncoiling itself in every gesture, in every breath, in every memory that would not fade. He wore mourning not only upon his sleeve, but upon his soul, a shadow that clung to him long after the funeral bells had ceased to toll. For Leopold, the loss was not merely of a wife, but of the world he had begun to build with her. At Claremont, every room bore her presence, the chairs where they had sat together, the walks where they had spoken of the future, the cradle that had awaited their child, all became reminders too heavy to endure. He wandered the halls in silence, sometimes pausing at her portrait, sometimes standing in the doorway of her chamber as though listening for her voice. His attendants spoke of him as a man hollowed, moving like a shadow of himself, his eyes fixed on what had been taken. He kept her belongings near, unwilling to let them go. A glove she had worn, a book she had marked, a lock of her hair. These became his treasures, talismans against the abyss of absence. He wrote of her in letters, confessing the depth of his sorrow, describing himself as broken, as widowed in the first flowering of love. He had been steady, calm, deliberate. Yet now his steadiness was shattered. The black ribbon that unfurled upon his table was also the ribbon that bound his heart in mourning. And the nation, too, wore black. Shop windows displayed draped cloth. Carriages were trimmed with dark fabric. Churches were filled with congregations dressed in mourning. It was said that the grief was so universal that one could walk the streets of London and see not a single bright garment. The silence of loss seemed stitched into the very fabric of the city, the echo of sorrow woven into every ribbon, every veil, every lowered head. Men who had never wept in public before found their eyes wet. Women who had never spoken of royalty found themselves mourning as though for kin. The people had loved Charlotte not distantly but intimately, and in her death they felt a personal wound. Leopold's grief was mirrored in the hearts of thousands, yet his was lonelier, deeper, bound to the private intimacies of love lost. He had promised her steadiness, and she had answered with joy. Now he was left with silence, and the promise had nowhere to go. He turned sometimes to prayer, sometimes to letters, sometimes to solitary walks in the gardens they had shared. The trees that had once shaded their laughter now stood mute witnesses to his sorrow, their branches bare in winter, their leaves fallen as if in sympathy. What does it mean, one wonders, to carry mourning so heavy that even joy cannot enter? Leopold would live many years more, would rise in stature, would guide others, yet he never ceased to carry Charlotte with him. In his mind she remained present, her voice remembered, her touch imagined, her absence felt as though it were still a wound unhealed. He described himself as a widower until his own death, refusing to set aside the memory of his young bride. His loyalty in grief became as renowned as their love in life, a symbol of constancy in a world that so often moved swiftly past sorrow. The black ribbon unfurls further, spreading across the table, curling into shadows. It is not only a personal mourning, but also a political silence. For with Charlotte gone, the succession of the crown became uncertain. George, Prince of Wales, now Prince Regent, had no other legitimate children. The uncles, once unconcerned, now found themselves pressured to marry, to produce heirs, to fill the void left by Charlotte's death. In the quiet of mourning, the machinery of dynasty stirred again, restless and urgent, seeking to repair what fate had broken. Yet for Leopold, such matters were distant. He had no crown to claim, no throne to secure, only the echo of a voice he could no longer hear. Picture him seated in a chair at Claremont, the fire before him reduced to embers, the room dim, the ribbon of mourning upon his coat. His gaze is fixed not on the flame but on the space beside him, empty, where once she had sat. He does not speak, he scarcely moves, but within him memory is louder than silence. The crackle of the fire seems to echo her laughter. The shadows on the wall seem to form her figure. The very air seems heavy with her absence. He lifts a hand, touches the arm of the chair, as though to feel her presence once more, but only emptiness greets him. The people remembered this grief, carried it with their own, and in Leopold's constancy they found something noble, something that bound him further into their affection. He had loved their princess. He had mourned her truly, and in mourning her, he had become part of their shared sorrow. He was not only the widower of Charlotte, he was the companion of a nation's grief. And yet grief does not remain still. It unfurls like the ribbon, curling outward, touching not only the widower, but the kingdom itself. From mourning rises reflection. From reflection comes the stirrings of change. The ribbon, black and endless, coils further into the corridors of power, into the chambers of ministers, into the hearts of a people still stunned. Charlotte was gone, but her absence was not empty. It was a force, reshaping what would come. The ribbon trails from the table to the floor, winding softly into shadow. It leads onward, out of the chamber of personal loss into the wide silence of public mourning, where bells toll and churches fill, where the kingdom bows its head as one. The bells toll, their sound rolling through the air like waves upon a distant shore, and then fading until only the hush of night remains. In that hush, Britain bowed its head, not in the scattered grief of families alone, but in a shared mourning that stretched from cottages to cities, from the poorest alley to the grandest hall. Charlotte's death was not a private sorrow. It was a wound that the entire nation seemed to feel. The night was filled with silence, a silence deeper than any words, as though the land itself stood still in reverence for what had been lost. In the weeks that followed, mourning took shape in every place and every heart. Shopkeepers draped their windows in black. Tradesmen wore armbands of mourning cloth. Theaters closed their doors. In parlors and workshops, in inns and chapels, her name was spoken in hushed tones, and tears fell as though for a daughter or a sister. It was said that even hardened men, soldiers and merchants unused to sentiment, wept openly in the streets. Newspapers carried columns heavy with lament. Poets wrote verses of sorrow. Preachers thundered from pulpits that the nation had been chastened by Providence. Yet the truest voice was the silence that fell when the bells ceased their tolling, when the streets were emptied of music, when even laughter seemed forbidden. Charlotte had not reigned. She had scarcely stepped beyond the threshold of young womanhood, yet her absence left a void that seemed to echo louder than the deaths of kings. Why was this so? Perhaps because the people had seen in her the reflection of their own longings, simplicity, warmth, closeness. She had not stood above them like a distant monarch, but among them, her laughter open, her words candid, her spirit recognizably human. In her they had believed the crown might be renewed, gentler, kinder, nearer to the life of the people. And when she was taken, they felt as though their own future had been taken with her. The funeral rites at Windsor had ended. The stone had closed over her and her stillborn child, yet the mourning did not end there. In homes across Britain, families gathered by candlelight, speaking of her, telling one another where they had been when they heard the news, how the bells had sounded in their parish, how the silence had pressed upon them. It became a memory shared, not of pageantry, but of loss. The hush of nightfall was repeated in 1,000 villages, 1,000 firesides, binding the people together in a net of grief. Imagine walking through London in those days, the lamps burning dim, the streets strangely subdued, the carriages trimmed in black, the shop signs veiled, the voices of passers-by low. The city, usually noisy with clatter and cheer, seemed softened, muffled, restrained. Even the river flowed with a quiet solemnity, its surface dark beneath the overcast sky. And in that city, silence, one could feel the collective weight of mourning, as though the very stones remembered the sound of bells and carried their echo into every footstep. Leopold remained at Claremont, his grief unrelieved, yet even there the silence was shared. Visitors came to offer condolences, ministers came with words of formality, friends came with tears. Each spoke of the princess, of her brightness, of her promise, of the loss that could not be measured. Yet no words could reach the depth of Leopold's sorrow, and so often the conversations fell into silence, broken only by the creak of chairs or the sigh of the wind through the trees outside. The hush of nightfall seemed to have entered the very air of Claremont, never lifting, never changing. And yet within this hush, reflections began to stir. What would the future hold now that Charlotte was gone? The succession, once seemingly secure, now lay uncertain. The regent had no legitimate heirs. His brothers had produced only children born outside of marriage, and the crown seemed suddenly precarious. Ministers, while they mourned, also calculated. Uncles, while they grieved, also looked to their own chances of marriage and succession. The hush of mourning carried within it not only sorrow but the faint rumble of change, the shifting of dynastic weight. But for the people, such matters were distant. Their grief was not for politics, but for Charlotte herself. They remembered her defiance, her laughter, her honesty, her humanity. They remembered the stories told of her walking among them, of her choosing love over exile, of her delight in simple things. They remembered her as one of their own, lifted high yet not lost to them. And now they remembered her in silence, each nightfall carrying her name softly upon the air, as though memory itself were a prayer. What is it, one wonders, that makes a silence so profound? Perhaps it is the absence of a voice once loved. Perhaps it is the echo of unfulfilled promise. Perhaps it is the recognition that destiny itself has shifted. The hush of nightfall after Charlotte's death was not merely the stillness of grief, but the dawning awareness that history had been altered, that what might have been would never be. The bells no longer toll, but their echo lingers. The night deepens, the stars appear faintly, the hush settles upon the land like a cloak. And in that hush a single candle burns low, its flame dwindling, its light fragile, until at last it flickers out, leaving only darkness and the image of a solitary candle, extinguished. The candle gutters, flickers once, and then goes out, leaving the chamber in darkness. In that extinguished flame lies the emblem of Charlotte's lost future, the sudden end of brightness, the vanishing of promise, the silence where once there had been light. Yet as the smoke curls upward into the air, faint and bitter, the imagination lingers upon what might have been. For when a life ends so early, it does not close with finality. It opens instead into questions, into reflections, into the unanswerable visions of what could have unfolded. Charlotte might have been queen. She might have sat upon the throne of Britain, not as the cold figure of ceremony, but as a monarch beloved by her people. In her laughter they had glimpsed sincerity. In her honesty they had felt kinship. In her stubborn defiance they had seen courage. What kind of reign would she have given, had fate spared her? Would she have softened the harshness of her father's legacy, brought gentleness to the image of monarchy, renewed its closeness with the people? Or would the burdens of power have worn down her warmth, pressed her into the mold of formality, dulled her brightness beneath the weight of crown and court? These questions hover in the dark, unresolved, as if the extinguished candle had left behind not only smoke, but also shadows that form themselves into shapes of speculation. Her contemporaries spoke often of this haunting possibility. In the months after her death, pamphlets and sermons alike described the sorrow not only of loss, but of deprivation. Britain had been deprived of the queen it might have known, deprived of the promise of a reign marked by sincerity and closeness. Some believed she would have been a monarch of the people, bridging the gulf between crown and subject, living not in distant grandeur, but in the warmth of domestic virtue. Others wondered whether her strong will, her quick temper, her refusal to yield might have clashed with ministers, with parliaments, with the inexorable machinery of governance. Would she have been loved still, or would she have become a figure of controversy, as her father had been? No one could say. The silence of her absence answered with nothing but mystery. Imagine her, had she lived, ascending the throne in her maturity, the coronation robes draped across her shoulders, the crown placed upon her brow, the scepter in her hand. Yet beneath the jewels her smile would have been the same, open and candid, her voice the same, forthright and warm. Would she have bent to the weight of tradition, Or would she have infused the crown with her own vitality? Would she have drawn the monarchy nearer to the people, as she had done in her youth? These visions rise like phantoms in the dark, each one plausible, each one fading as quickly as it forms. The people, in their grief, clung to these imaginings. They spoke of her as the queen who never was, the light that might have shone but was extinguished too soon. In their hearts she grew into an almost mythic figure, not defined by deeds accomplished, but by the possibilities unfulfilled. Her death froze her in youth, in promise, in potential, making her forever the figure of what might have been, and in this, she became in some sense larger than life, a symbol not of reign, but of longing. Leopold, in his sorrow, sometimes spoke of what she would have become. He described her intelligence, her warmth, her strength of will, and he mourned not only the loss of her companionship, but the loss of the queen she might have been. He imagined the children they might have had, the family they might have built, the reign they might have shared. His grief was not only for the past, but for the future denied. The extinguished candle was, to him, the extinguishing of every dream they had spoken together in the quiet of Claremont's rooms. What is it about an unfinished life that lingers so powerfully? Perhaps because it leaves space for imagination, for hope projected, for visions untested by reality. A life lived fully is judged by its deeds, by its triumphs and its failures. A life cut short is judged by its potential, and potential is infinite. Charlotte, therefore, became in memory not only the lost princess, but the forever possible queen, her image untainted by age, her promise unsoured by disappointment. In the darkness after her candle went out, she shone in memory all the brighter. Yet memory, for all its tenderness, cannot restore what was lost. The silence after the extinguished flame remained heavy, pressing upon her husband, her people, her dynasty. The monarchy that might have been under Charlotte would never be, and the crown was forced to seek another path. Ministers turned their eyes to her uncles, pressing them to marry, to produce heirs, to fill the void left by her. The hush of mourning gave way slowly to the stirrings of politics, to the scramble of dynastic necessity. But the people lingered longer in their sorrow, unwilling to let go of the queen who never was. The candle lies cold, its wick blackened, its smoke faded into air. The chamber is dark, but in that darkness imagination lingers, spinning visions, raising questions, whispering what if. And from those whispers emerges the faint scratch of a quill upon paper once more. Hurried now, urgent, as royal decrees are drawn and alliances sought, as the machinery of succession begins to move again in the wake of silence. The quill scratches across parchment, hurried, insistent, the ink flowing in strokes that betray not contemplation but urgency. Ministers bend over desks, letters are dispatched to foreign courts, treaties whispered into draft. In the wake of Charlotte's death, the machinery of dynasty stirred with sudden force, as though awakened by the silence she had left behind. For her passing had not only torn at hearts, it had torn at the very fabric of succession. With no child to follow her, with her father, the Prince Regent, estranged from his wife, and aging without further heirs, the future of the crown seemed perilously uncertain. And so the quill hurried, pressing pen to paper as if words might stitch the torn fabric together. Attention turned to the regent's brothers, the uncles of Charlotte, men who had lived content with their comforts, their mistresses, their private households, never pressed by urgency to provide legitimate heirs. Now that complacency was broken. They were urged, almost commanded, to set aside their old ways, to marry properly, to produce children who might inherit the throne. In the silence of mourning there arose the scramble of ambition, the unseemly spectacle of middle-aged men hastening to secure brides as though fate itself were driving them. It was a curious spectacle, both solemn and absurd. Dukes who had long ignored dynastic duty now searching across Europe for suitable princesses, negotiations conducted with speed, weddings arranged with haste. The people, still wrapped in grief for Charlotte, looked on with a mixture of resignation and faint cynicism. They mourned the young life lost, the promise unfulfilled, and in its place they saw only the awkward efforts of men who had waited too long. The quill scratched, the decrees were signed, but the air was heavy with the sense that nothing could replace what had been lost. And yet from this scramble would come the line that would shape the century. Among the brothers was Edward, Duke of Kent, who, compelled by the urgency of succession, sought marriage with Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, the widowed sister of Leopold. The match, like the others, was driven not by passion, but by necessity. Yet from this union a child would be born, a girl named Alexandrina Victoria, whose reign would stretch long and vast across the 19th century. In the hurried scratch of the quill across decrees, in the anxious marriages of Charlotte's uncles, the path was being drawn toward a future that none could yet imagine, the age of Victoria. But at the time, none of this was clear. To those who lived in the shadow of Charlotte's death, the future seemed uncertain, the monarchy fragile, the people anxious. Ministers calculated the risks of instability, pamphleteers speculated on succession, and across drawing rooms the question was asked again and again, what now? The loss of Charlotte had left not only sorrow, but a vacuum, and vacuums draw swiftly at the fabric of power. The hurried scratching of quills in royal chambers was the sound of that vacuum being filled, however imperfectly. Yet behind the official bustle, the people remembered Charlotte still. They had not forgotten the laughter in her voice, the openness in her manner, the hope she had carried in her very presence. While ministers wrote decrees and dukes sought brides, ordinary men and women spoke of her as though she still lived, as though she might yet appear among them. They carried her memory in tokens, in portraits hung upon their walls, in verses copied into commonplace books. Her image remained vivid, her absence made sharper by the spectacle of her uncle's sudden urgency. What is it, one wonders, that makes dynastic necessity so cold when set beside human grief? The hurried marriages, the scratched decrees, the anxious calculations, these were necessary, perhaps, for the survival of the crown, but they could not soothe the heart. They could not answer the silence left by Charlotte. They could only patch the succession, not heal the wound. The people watching must have felt this contrast, the warmth of their mourning, the coldness of official response. The one was human, the other mechanical, and between them lay the figure of Charlotte, remembered not for decrees signed or treaties arranged, but for her laughter, her defiance, her promise. Imagine then the chamber where the quill scratches late into the night. The ink pot is nearly empty. The papers pile high, the candle burns low. Ministers lean wearily over documents, their eyes strained, their minds anxious. Outside, the night is still, the air heavy, the hush of mourning still lingering. Within, the scratching continues, as though by writing enough words they might restore stability. But no words, however many, can bring back the princess whose absence has driven them to this frenzy. The quill scratches, but the silence beyond the chamber is deeper still, and yet history does not stand still. The ink dries, the papers are sealed, the marriages are arranged, and from those unions the future unfolds. Out of the urgency of succession comes the birth of a child who will one day be queen, who will reign long and define an era. But that is not yet known. For now, the scratching of the quill ends, the candle gutters, and the silence of the night is broken only by the faint cry of a child carried on the wind, distant yet clear, the promise of a new life beginning to stir. The wind carries a sound so light that at first it seems no more than the stirring of leaves, but then it takes on shape, the clear and innocent peal of a child's laughter. It drifts through the branches, across the stillness of night, as if the future itself were calling faintly through the silence left by Charlotte's death. That laughter belonged not to the child she lost, nor to any child she might have borne, but to another, yet unborn, destined to take her place upon the path of succession. It was the laughter of Alexandrina Victoria, daughter of Edward, Duke of Kent, and Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, whose birth 2 years after Charlotte's passing would alter the course of Britain. The chain of fate is delicate, its links forged from accident, tragedy, and necessity. Charlotte's death, mourned as catastrophe, became in time the cause that set her uncle Edward to marry, the cause that brought forth Victoria, the cause that reshaped a century. Without the silence of Claremont, without the extinguished cradle, there might have been no Victorian age. In this way, sorrow curved into destiny, loss into renewal, the extinguished candle into a new flame. Yet at the time, none knew it. In the hush of 1817, the people saw only darkness. It was only in the cry of a child 2 years later that the first glimmer of light returned. Victoria was born in Kensington Palace in 1819, small, delicate, and yet with a vitality that surprised even those who doubted she would survive infancy. Her father died when she was still an infant, leaving her mother and her uncle Leopold to shape her upbringing. Leopold, still shadowed by grief for Charlotte, poured his affection into his niece. He became to her a guiding figure, advising, nurturing, protecting, as though in caring for Victoria he could continue the love he had once given Charlotte. It was said that he often looked upon the child and whispered to himself that Charlotte might have been as she was, had fate been kinder. What does it mean for one life to give way to another, for the loss of one, to open the path for another's reign? History is filled with such paradoxes, where death and birth, grief and joy intertwine so tightly that one cannot be understood without the other. Charlotte's fate was tragic, yet from it arose the reign of Victoria, a reign that would stretch more than 60 years, shaping not only Britain, but much of the world. The laughter carried on the wind was, in truth, the sound of a century being born from the silence of mourning. Yet it would be too simple to say that Charlotte's memory vanished into Victoria's rise. The people did not forget her. They could not. When Victoria came to the throne in 1837, many still remembered the princess who had been lost 20 years before. Some looked upon the new queen and whispered that she carried within her the promise Charlotte had once held. Others wondered whether she would be so beloved, so candid, so close to the people. And in a strange way, Charlotte's shadow shaped Victoria's reign, a reminder of what might have been and what must now be fulfilled. Leopold's role in this was profound. He became King of the Belgians in 1831, yet he never ceased to act as counselor to his niece. Letters passed between them for decades, filled with his advice, his reflections, his encouragement. He taught her the balance of duty and affection, the art of ruling with steadiness, the importance of domestic virtue. In guiding her, he passed on what he and Charlotte had once dreamed of building together. It was as if Charlotte's spirit, though gone, still whispered through Leopold's words, shaping the reign of the child who followed her. And what of Charlotte herself, remembered in this new age? She became in memory the hinge between two eras, the lost heir whose absence gave rise to the Victorian dynasty. Her portraits remained in homes, her name spoken with tenderness by those old enough to recall her. To them, she was not eclipsed by Victoria, but rather connected to her, a reminder that history moves not in straight lines, but in curves of fate, where loss and renewal are bound together. Imagine the scene. a garden at Claremont years after Charlotte's passing, where Leopold walks with his niece Victoria. The child holds his hand, her laughter ringing through the trees. He looks down upon her with affection, but his eyes drift to the trees, the paths, the benches where once he had walked with Charlotte. In his mind the two images blur, the lost wife and the new niece, the extinguished hope and the renewed promise. He smiles, but there is sadness in the smile, the recognition that joy and grief are forever entwined. What might Charlotte have thought? Could she have glimpsed the future? Would she have felt sorrow that her child would never reign, or relief that her cousin would take her place? Would she have envied Victoria, or would she have felt comfort that the monarchy endured, even through her loss? These questions cannot be answered. They drift like the wind that carries the sound of a child's laughter. Questions as light and elusive as the laughter itself. The wind fades. The sound of the child's joy softens, and the night deepens once more. In the distance, the halls of celebration will one day echo with Victoria's reign. But for now, in this moment of transition, the laughter lingers faintly, carrying us onward into the shadowed halls where Charlotte's father still sits, his reign heavy, his heart estranged, the emptiness of her absence pressing upon him. The banquet hall glitters with light, chandeliers heavy with candles, the tables spread with silver and wine, yet the echoes that fill the chamber are hollow. Laughter rises, but it rings thin. Music plays, but it does not warm the air. For within these halls sits George, now Prince Regent, soon to be George IV, his daughter gone, his line broken, his legacy darkened. The banquet, for all its splendor, cannot disguise the emptiness that Charlotte's absence has left. The spaces between the notes of the music are wider, the pauses between the bursts of laughter longer, as though the revelry itself knows it is only a mask. George had lived long for pleasure, long for display, long for the glitter of court and the indulgence of appetite. He was a man of extravagance, of debts piled high, of passions that burned hot and faded quickly. To him, Charlotte had been at once a promise and a reproach. She embodied the hope of succession, the continuity of his line, yet she also embodied the love of the people that he could never win. Her defiance had wounded him, her popularity had overshadowed him, and her loss now left him with nothing but the heavy crown of disappointment. In the banquet hall he sat, adorned yet weary, his eyes restless, his heart estranged from joy. Those who watched him saw not majesty but decay, a man who had lived for pleasure and found only emptiness, a king who would reign but never inspire. His reign was marked by splendor of appearance, but hollowness of spirit, by processions and monuments that sought to impress, but did not heal the fractures between crown and people. The banquet hall, echoing with hollow cheer, was the true emblem of his kingship. What must he have thought in the quiet hours, when the candles burned low and the music ceased? Did he think of Charlotte, the daughter who had resisted him, yet might have secured his dynasty? Did he imagine her laughter filling the hall more truly than all the forced merriment of courtiers? Or did he close his heart, unwilling to dwell upon the wound, preferring instead to drown memory in wine and music? The records do not tell us. They leave us only the image of a hollow reign, a reign without air, a reign heavy with absence. The people, still mourning Charlotte, looked upon George with cold eyes. They saw in him the contrast. Where she had been loved, he was resented. Where she had been candid, he was duplicitous. Where she had been fresh, he was weary. They did not forget that she had been taken, and in their grief they found little solace in his pageantry. He became in their minds the figure of what monarchy should not be, while Charlotte remained the figure of what it might have been. The banquet hall glittered, but outside, in the homes of common folk, her memory burned brighter than his crown. Leopold, far from these banquets, carried his sorrow in silence. He did not seek distraction in revelry, but held to his mourning with constancy. The contrast between him and George was stark. One clung to memory with loyalty, the other sought to cover it with splendor. Yet neither could alter the truth. The heir was gone. The throne stood precarious, the monarchy weakened by its own contradictions. Imagine again the banquet hall, the chandeliers burning low, the air heavy with the smell of wax and wine. The guests laugh politely, but their eyes glance often toward the empty space where Charlotte might have been, had fate been kinder. The music plays, but beneath its notes lingers the silence of a daughter never to return. Even amid splendor, absence makes itself known. Even amid glitter, emptiness resounds. What is it, one wonders, that makes absence so loud? Perhaps because it cannot be hidden. A crown may glitter, a hall may shine, but where love is lacking, the emptiness echoes. Charlotte's absence became the measure of George's reign. Every display seemed thinner for her loss, every cheer more hollow, every monument more fragile. He would reign until 1830, but his reign was already haunted, shadowed not by enemies but by memory. The banquet ends, the candles are snuffed one by one, the hall grows dark, the echoes fade. The emptiness remains, heavy, unrelieved, pressing upon the stones as upon the heart. And into that darkness, in some quiet chamber, rests a small relic of Charlotte, a lock of her hair pressed between the pages of a book, waiting for the hand that will one day open it. Between the pages lies a single curl of hair, pale and soft, bound with a thin thread, preserved not as ornament, but as memory. The book closes around it, and yet it is not forgotten. It rests there, like a heartbeat, hidden in silence. Such relics of Charlotte were treasured by many, for her death had left behind not only grief, but a hunger for remembrance. Portraits were painted and copied, prints circulated, medallions struck, songs composed. The people, unwilling to let her fade, clung to her image in every form they could. In their homes hung likenesses of her face, in their drawers rested tokens with her profile stamped upon them, in their books lingered verses written in her honor. She became, in death, what she had been in life, beloved but now also sanctified by sorrow. Her portraits show her not as queen, for she never reigned, but as maiden and bride, bright-eyed, smiling faintly, her hair gathered loosely, her figure strong and youthful. They became almost icons, carried not only in palaces but in humble cottages, where ordinary families looked upon her as though upon a lost daughter. Ballads were sung in streets and parlors, mourning her fate, recalling her promise, weaving her story into the fabric of popular memory. Even those who had never seen her felt as though they had known her, for her image was everywhere, her name upon every lip. Leopold himself kept relics of her, treasured beyond measure. Her letters, her belongings, the lock of hair he guarded with devotion. To him, these were not symbols for a nation, but fragments of a life shared, fragments of love lost. He read her letters again and again, hearing her voice in the uneven strokes, imagining her laughter in the words that tumbled across the page. To him, the lock of hair was not merely a relic, but a presence, a touch of her that had not faded. And so Charlotte became remembered not only in the grand ceremonies of mourning, but in the private tokens of affection. A miniature hung upon a chain, a curl preserved in a locket, a print tucked between the pages of a prayer book. These were the ways her memory endured in the hearts of the people. She had been theirs in life, close to them, and they would not let her slip away in death. Her image became part of their daily lives, seen in the turning of pages, in the lighting of candles, in the singing of songs. What does it mean for memory to take form in objects? Perhaps it is the human need to hold on to what slips too easily away. hair that once shone in the light, paper that once bore the press of her hand, portraits that captured the glimmer of her gaze. These became vessels of memory, tangible and enduring where life itself was fleeting. They could not restore her, but they could preserve the sense of her presence. In this way, Charlotte's life continued, not as flesh and breath, but as relic and remembrance. The people spoke of her often in those years, telling stories of her defiance, her laughter, her tenderness. They passed on tales to their children, who grew up knowing her name even though they had never seen her. In taverns and in drawing rooms, her memory was invoked as a contrast to the coldness of the reigning monarch. She became the measure of what might have been, the reminder of what was lost, the beloved figure whose absence made itself present in every corner. Imagine a humble cottage where a family gathers by the hearth. Upon the mantel sits a small print of Charlotte, her profile etched in soft lines. The mother glances at it as she sews, the father as he rests after work, the children as they play at her feet. They do not know her personally, yet they feel her as kin. When they speak of her, they do so with tenderness, as though recalling a cousin or a sister. In their eyes, she is not only a princess, but a part of themselves, taken from them too soon, mourned as though from their own blood. Such memory shaped more than sentiment. It shaped values. Charlotte, remembered in her domestic happiness at Claremont, in her devotion to Leopold, in her promise of motherhood, became a symbol of virtue, of fidelity, of family. In her image, the people saw not extravagance but simplicity, not vice but promise, and in this image they began to hold monarchy to a new standard. They longed for rulers who embodied the domestic virtues Charlotte had symbolized, who would be not distant figures of luxury, but close figures of family and sincerity. In this way, her memory quietly influenced the expectations of an age yet to come. The lock of hair rests still between the pages, unchanged by time, fragile yet enduring. It speaks silently of presence and absence, of love and loss, of memory and longing. And as the book closes upon it once more, the faint tick of a clock sounds in the quiet, marking the passage of time, carrying her memory forward into the long echo of the century. The clock ticks, steady and patient, each stroke a reminder that time draws forward even when hearts linger behind. With each measured beat, the world moves further from the night of Charlotte's death, yet her memory remains, woven into the fabric of lives and expectations that endure beyond her years. The tick of time does not erase, it reshapes, carrying her presence into new forms, into new meanings, into the long echo of the Victorian age. As the years unfolded and Victoria ascended the throne, the memory of Charlotte became less a fresh wound and more a guiding shadow. Her life, brief and unfinished, came to symbolize virtues that the new queen was expected to embody: domesticity, fidelity, warmth, and a sense of moral closeness to the people. Charlotte's death had left the nation yearning for a monarchy that felt not distant and extravagant, but near and virtuous. Victoria, though different in character, inherited these expectations, and in fulfilling them, she carried forward a legacy that was not wholly her own. The Victorian cult of family, so central to the age, bore within it the seeds of Charlotte's remembered promise. The people had mourned her not only as a princess, but as a wife and mother, and they had idealized her happiness at Claremont as the model of domestic virtue. When Victoria and Albert presented themselves as devoted spouses and parents, the people recognized in them the fulfillment of what Charlotte had embodied and lost. The hearth became as symbolic as the throne, the nursery as important as the council chamber. It was as though the silence left by Charlotte had whispered a lesson, that monarchy could survive only if it lived close to the values of home and hearth. And so her absence shaped a presence, The age that followed was marked not only by industrial might and imperial power, but also by an ideal of family life that reached even into the highest chambers of royalty. The virtues of fidelity, motherhood, and moral example became as vital as the crown itself. One wonders, would this have been so had Charlotte lived? Would her reign have borne these values naturally through her own warmth and closeness? Or was it her death, her absence, that made them so powerfully desired, so fervently embraced in the reign that followed? The clock ticks, but it does not answer. Leopold, watching from Belgium, continued to shape this unfolding. His letters to Victoria guided her, his counsel steady, his affection for her sincere. In him lingered the ghost of Charlotte, for he often spoke of her to his niece, reminding her of the values Charlotte had held dear, reminding her of the tenderness that should guide power. In this way, Charlotte's spirit, though silenced, spoke still, carried forward in the words of the man who had loved her most. The people, too, though decades passed, did not entirely let her go. In ballads, in recollections, in anecdotes told by those who had been young in 1817, Charlotte remained alive. Her name was spoken with a kind of reverence, softened by time but never erased. Even as Victoria's reign stretched long and firm, there were those who would pause, hearing the name of Charlotte, and remember the lost princess, the promise unfulfilled. For memory does not vanish with time. It changes its form, it mellows, but it endures. Imagine a family gathered in the 1840s, children at their mother's knee, hearing the tale of Charlotte. The mother speaks softly of the princess who had once been destined to be queen, who had loved truly, who had died too soon. The children listen wide-eyed, their imaginations filled with her image, their hearts stirred by the tenderness of her story. For them, she is already legend, part of the fabric of the nation, a reminder that history is not only battles and crowns, but also love and loss. The clock ticks on, measuring these years, carrying memory forward. Each stroke is both distance and connection, distance from the night of her passing, connection to the ways in which her memory still shapes lives. For Charlotte became not only a figure of grief, but a figure of influence, her absence casting long shadows into the age that followed. She was the unfinished chapter that shaped the story written after her. And what is influence, if not the quiet shaping of hearts and minds long after breath is gone? Charlotte influenced not by decree or law, not by rule or reign, but by memory, by the tenderness of what might have been. Her absence became presence, her silence became voice, her death became a lesson that guided the living. In this way, she was not lost, but transformed, carried forward in the ticking of time, in the unfolding of an age that bore her shadow. The clock ticks still, steady, relentless. Its sound fills the quiet of the room, mingling with the fading light, reminding us that time moves on, yet memory remains. And as the hand moves forward, the sound grows softer, merging into the rising mist of a lake at dawn, where reflection hovers, uncertain upon the surface. The mist rises over the water, pale and formless, veiling the surface so that the line between air and reflection is blurred. Shapes of trees at the edges soften into shadows, and the stillness of the lake holds the mist as though it were a secret. In this quiet place, memory and speculation mingle, for the figure of Charlotte lives here not in certainty but in reflection, in the endless question of what might have been. Historians, poets, and ordinary men and women alike have looked upon her life as upon this mist, something glimpsed, something imagined, never fully grasped. For Charlotte left behind not a reign to be judged, but a promise to be wondered at. She did not have years to reveal her strengths or weaknesses in full. She did not shape policy, nor command armies, nor govern an empire. Instead, she left the outline of possibility, and in that outline each observer has painted their own vision. Some see in her the queen who might have healed the rift between crown and people, whose candid warmth would have softened monarchy into closeness. Others see a young woman of strong will and quick temper, who might have clashed with ministers, whose reign might have been fraught with contention. Both images rise in the mist, both dissolve, both remain unanswerable. What is it in human hearts that clings to the question, what if? Perhaps it is the refusal to let go, the desire to hold the lost figure still within the world by imagining the paths they might have walked. In Charlotte's case, the mist of speculation has lingered longer than in most, because she carried so much of a nation's hope. Her story was not only personal but national, and so her absence was felt not only in the chamber of her husband, but in the streets of her people. To ask what might have been is not idle curiosity. It is an act of mourning, stretched across generations. Leopold himself often walked within this mist of reflection. In his later years, he spoke with tenderness of Charlotte, remembering not only her laughter but also her strength, her independence, her vision. He believed she would have been a great queen, beloved and wise, had fate not cut her short. To him, the mist was clear. He saw in her the reign they had imagined together in the quiet gardens of Claremont. But his was a lover's memory, shaped by devotion, touched with longing. For others, the mist shifted differently. Ministers who had found her stubborn imagined difficulty. Courtiers who had admired her honesty imagined renewal. Each gaze upon the mist revealed a different shape, each reflection a different story. The lake holds these shapes quietly, undisturbed by certainty. Perhaps this is fitting, for history often gives us facts, but lives give us mysteries, and mysteries linger where facts cannot tread. Charlotte's mystery is this: not what she was, but what she might have been. And in that question lies the power of her memory. She is not confined to one narrative, but open to many, each person seeing in her the reflection of their own hopes or fears. Imagine the mist thickening, the lake nearly hidden, the world beyond softened into vagueness. Within it, shapes emerge: Charlotte upon a throne, Charlotte as mother, Charlotte as reformer, Charlotte as figure of contention. Each vision flickers, fades, returns, as insubstantial as the mist itself. To stand upon the shore is to see them all and to know that none can be grasped. The reflection is always shifting, always dissolving, always reforming. And perhaps it is this very elusiveness that has kept her alive in memory longer than many who reigned in reality. For a reign can be judged, criticized, concluded, but a life cut short cannot be concluded. It must be imagined. Charlotte, therefore, belongs not only to history but to imagination, to longing, to the poetry of what if. She is the unfinished line that every generation completes in its own way. The Victorians saw in her the lost domestic ideal, the contrast to George's hollow pageantry. Later ages saw in her the figure of tragedy, a reminder of the fragility of succession. Even now, her name carries the echo of possibility, the shimmer of mist upon water. And what of us looking back across 2 centuries? Do we see her as the lost queen, the shadow of Victoria, the daughter of estranged parents, the wife of a grieving widower? Or do we see her as something larger, as a figure who embodies the fragility of life itself, the way promise can be extinguished in an instant, the way destiny is shaped not by what occurs, but by what is lost? The mist upon the lake offers no single answer. It offers only reflection, shifting, dissolving, returning. The mist rises higher, spreading across the water, softening even the sound of the world. A bird calls faintly, then is swallowed by the haze. The lake becomes a mirror of uncertainty, and in it the story of Charlotte lingers, unfinished, unresolved, eternal in its questions. And as the mist drifts further, it carries us toward the final hush, where memory itself becomes silence, and silence becomes presence. The mist drifts higher, softening the outlines of trees, veiling the water until all that remains is a whiteness that seems both presence and absence. In this hush, we arrive at the final turning of Charlotte's story, a tale not completed but laid to rest in silence, for hers was a life of beginnings, the beginning of promise, the beginning of love, the beginning of motherhood. Yet each beginning was cut short, each path ended before its time, leaving only echoes. And yet those echoes, faint and lingering, have carried across centuries, reminding us that even an unfinished life can shape the world. Charlotte's presence is felt most keenly in her absence. She is remembered not for decrees or battles, not for victories or failures, but for the light that might have been. She was the promise of a monarch beloved, the dream of a reign renewed, the image of a crown made close to its people. She was also the laughter in gardens, the defiance in youth, the tenderness in love. These fragments remain, stitched together by memory, by imagination, by longing. They form a tapestry not of history concluded, but of history forever open, an unfinished pattern that draws the eye precisely because it is incomplete. Her story became the seed of another. Without her death, Victoria might never have reigned, and the age that bears her name might have taken another shape. In this way, Charlotte lingers within the long Victorian century, not as shadow but as foundation, the values the people came to expect. Domestic virtue, fidelity, closeness were shaped as much by her loss as by Victoria's reign. Her absence spoke loudly, teaching lessons that presence alone might not have taught. Thus, even in silence, she shaped the world that followed. Leopold carried her within him all his life. As King of the Belgians, he guided his people with the steadiness that had comforted Charlotte, yet he never ceased to speak of her, to think of her, to mourn her. His letters to Victoria were filled with the wisdom of experience, but also with the tenderness of memory. Through him, Charlotte's spirit seemed to whisper across years, shaping not only a niece, but an era. He had promised her constancy, and he kept it, even in death. The people, too, kept her memory. They told her story by firesides, passed down prints of her likeness, preserved tokens of her presence. They spoke of her as though she were kin, and in doing so they ensured she would not fade. Even now, 2 centuries later, her story remains, retold not for pageantry, but for the poignancy of its incompletion. For in every age we look back upon her and ask again the same questions, find again the same sorrow, feel again the same tenderness. The unfinished story never ceases to stir. And so we come to the close, not with resolution, but with remembrance. Imagine her once more, walking in the gardens of Claremont, her hand resting lightly upon Leopold's arm, her laughter carried upon the wind. Imagine her pausing before the cradle, her hand upon its wooden edge, her eyes filled with the hope of motherhood. Imagine her seated by the fire, writing letters in her uneven hand, speaking candidly, living fully, her spirit unbound. These are visions, reflections, fragments. They are all we have, yet they are enough to remind us that her life, though brief, was not empty. It was lived, and in being lived, it left its mark. What then do we take from her story as we let it rest? Perhaps the lesson that life is not measured only by years or deeds, but by presence, by the impression left upon others, by the love given and received. Charlotte gave love. She received it, and she left behind a memory that endured. In this way, she was not forgotten, nor ever shall be. She was the candle extinguished, yet her smoke lingered in the air, visible long after the flame was gone. The mist upon the lake thickens, then slowly begins to part. The first light of dawn touches the water, soft and pale, a reminder that time does not end with loss. The world turns, the sun rises, memory remains. And in that rising light, Charlotte's story drifts into silence, carried upon the wind, into the hearts of those who remember, into the quiet where sleep begins. Rest now, listener, with her memory. Let the hush of her unfinished story guide you into your own stillness, into your own dreams. For in remembering her, we remember ourselves, our own fragility, our own longing, our own hope. And though her tale ends in silence, her presence lingers still, timeless, like the echo of a voice carried across night into dawn.